Our world is obsessed with identity. Where do we find our identity? What is it rooted in? How do we determine it? What we're going to find as we continue on in Genesis is it all starts at creation. Let's dive in. Have you ever felt like you don't belong? Today, my family, we're about to actually take a road trip to California for the week, and it's going to cost about $500 in gas. I'm super excited about it. Filling a minivan full of children is not going to be fun. But a couple weeks ago, we realized our kids don't really have shoes that fit their feet. And in case you didn't know, if you've never looked at kids' shoes, they're expensive. I think they should be a fourth of the cost of a normal shoe because they're tinier, but shoe companies disagree. So we decided to go over to the Tanger outlets in Glendale and make a day of it shopping with 3 kids 5 and under. Didn't go well, let's just say that. So then after we get these shoes and we finally find some, and after we went to a couple stores, we're like, hey, let's do a little surprise, let's do something fun. Let's go to Cabela's. They'll love that. They got a fish tank. There's some animals they can see. And as I'm walking around Cabela's, in my flip-flops, in my cut-off corduroy shorts, with a 5-panel hipster hat, I was like, this is not my place. I'm just gonna say that. I'm a city boy. I'm okay with saying that. Some of it, okay, that's cool. Yeah, let's throw some knives, let's shoot. But I went by the fishing section, which is half the store, I felt like. I didn't know there was so much stuff about fishing. I walk into Home Depot, I actually feel pretty comfortable. I know what they are. But I see at the fishing stuff, I'm like, what is all this stuff do? Why is there a million different things? I thought you need a rod, a string, and a hook, and that's all you need for fishing, right? And it became abundantly clear, I do not belong in the fishing section or anywhere close to there. Increasingly in our culture, as our culture changes, and hopefully as we change and become better followers of Christ and closer to Him, there may be times when we look around our circle and we feel a little bit like we don't belong. We're out of place. All of a sudden we're not as good of a fisher, or we're not interested in this and the same thing that our old life used to be. Today, we're continuing our series through the book of Genesis, and we're going to kind of explore a concept that is so foreign to our world and to our culture, this concept called Imago Dei. And as we dive into this today, we're going to see how this is so different and so crazy from our world. But here's what I want to say is, even though this may divide us from culture in so many ways, it may divide our thinking, as we study this and as we learn this today and continuing on in this pursuit in Genesis, it should cause us to love people to a greater degree. And you see, sometimes this is where I think we get it wrong in the church, is we're we should be different than culture. We should stand out. We shouldn't necessarily like the same things, engage in the same things, but we should still love the people just as much. Last week, we kind of wrapped up the creation count of Genesis, and we went through these 6 days and see how God created the earth. Well, today we're going to kind of go back into the very end of it, and we're going to look at the creation of people in day 6. And as we start this, I want to give you a key thought that is important that we kind of stick in our mind. And we're going to really flesh out and dive into this morning. And it is this, that mankind is different from all other life, and that we are made in the image of God. You see, this concept that we're talking about, Imago Dei, that's exactly what it means. It means made in the image of God, that we were created, and then we get this from Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, that it is birthed out of that mankind, men and women, were different than all other creation. Now, this term, Imago Dei, is actually a very loaded term. And for centuries, theologians have kind of debated and kind of talked over, what does all this mean? With some of the early interpretations, because when we read this, it says that God created an image in His likeness. And in the very early interpretation of this, that they said the image of God means that it refers to the ability for us to reason, for us to think. If you've ever watched a dog, it doesn't think that much, okay? Just because its eyes are moving, it's not thinking. It's thinking about, do I need to eat or do I need to poop, right? It's not thinking about complex issues of the day, right? There's not a lot going in there. And cats, they might be plotting your murder, but that's all they're doing, okay? They're evil, I'm just saying. You know who I'm talking to. But in here, there's here he says this idea of image refers to reason, is what they said, where likeness would refer to a person's corresponds, the spiritual relationship with God. Well, as kind of time went on, then there was different interpretations came up. The more reformed kind of thinking was that we were created, we were perfect, and then that image, that Imago Dei, was broken in the fall, which we'll get to in the next couple chapters. But we will be restored to our image of God, this Imago Dei, when eventually Christ brings us into the new heaven and the new earth. In the last century, these views of this concept have even changed more. Some have argued that this just strictly means physical likeness, that we are created in the image of God, meaning somehow we resemble what God might look like. But over the last half of the century, really the popular interpretation of all this has become the functional one, that the image is humanity's divinely order to rule over earth. That we are in charge here, that mankind is the highest pinnacle of creation on earth. But this also kind of relates to the idea that God has gifted us a special responsibility, a special role, that it's almost like in a royal terms that we are God's spokesman and we are God's people here on earth to do his will. But here's the deal. The real important part of all this and kind of the sticking point for us today is as we study this, that we are separate from the rest of mankind, whether that is physical, that is spiritual, that is psychological or social or all of the above. But here's the real question I want us to spend our time diving into today is why does this matter? Why is it so important? Why does it matter that people are created in the image of God? I love sometimes to just reflect over my life, right? I got too much, sometimes I just need to stop scrolling social media and I just think about how did I get here? How did my life all turn out? And what are all the steps that have? And sometimes I like to reflect on big things in my life that changed my perspective of how I saw the world. One of the things I was thinking about this last week is when I got a real job. And what do I mean by a real job? I mean, when I stopped working high school jobs and college jobs I didn't care about, and if the place was on fire, I'm clocked out, bro, see ya. I'm out. Something was wrong with my food. There's a manager you gotta talk to over there. I don't care. I was a great worker, right? I really was. But I remember the perspective changing when I got a real job out of college, and I had an office, and I was a boss, and I was in charge of stuff. And I remember that realization dawning on me, man, if I mess this up, it's on me. They're gonna come talk to me. When I have to go to work, I actually have to try hard because people will know if I don't, right? If when I do stuff and I can't, and I was salary, so I can't just not do my job because I actually have to complete work. So if I don't complete the work, I stay longer until I get it done. And I remember this perspective totally changed the way I saw my job. And you see, there are things in our lives that come around and they change our perspective. They change how we perceive the world around us. And today, as we dive into this thing of we are created in the image of God, it should change our perspective of how we see the world. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and flip to Genesis chapter 1. And we're gonna be at the very back half of this chapter, and we're gonna be starting in verse 26 today. And in Genesis chapter 1, I think we get three kind of clear quality answers of why does it matter so much that we are created in the image of God? And what does this interpretation, what does it mean for our lives? And the first thing we're gonna see is that people have value. Let's check this out, Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 26. It says this, then God said, let us make man in our own image, according to our likeness. Now, some will say and there, but the dominant interpretation is it's kind of restating the same thing. Image and likeness are pretty much the same here. He says, let in our image, according to our likeness, they will rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth. Now, we spent a lot of time going through the creation account over the last 4 weeks and talking about the detail, the intentionality that God took in creating our universe, that God took in creating the earth. And we see all this, and what's so amazing is I think it makes this verse all the more powerful. You see, God took 5.5 days to create the sun, to create all the stars, to create the oceans and the land and the plants and the birds and everything in the sea that we don't know about that's lurking down there and we still haven't discovered. And in everything, and all land animals, he took 5.5 days to create. But then the very last half of the last day, he creates mankind. And you see, this is the only thing that he makes in his own image. And what we get from here, and if all the people, if God is calling creation good all along the way, then he creates mankind, it's created in his image, an eternal, perfect God who's lived forever, then mankind is a pretty big deal. And what's even a little bit more for this is that if we were good when he created us and created us in his image, then all people have value. Now I say that, and maybe that kind of brushes by you, and you're like, okay, who cares? Like, what's the point? Like, one, I'll get in a second, I don't think we all actually live that out, and our culture doesn't at large, but this was super revolutionary when this was written. We kind of talked about sometime, Genesis was written in somewhere between 1400 and 1600 BC when Moses was alive. And when he wrote this, the prevailing idea in the cultures around it, what's called ancient Near Eastern, especially Egypt, was that really the only one that had ultimate value was the king or the pharaoh. They actually took on the persona, the likeness of the god. In Egypt, they believed they were avatars. The god would literally come into the pharaoh, would rule all the people, and he was God. He was like God, but nobody else had value, and a slave was like nothing. So the Bible coming around and this writing almost like 3,500 years ago saying all people have value, that would be mind-blowing. Now we come to today and you're like, oh, well, we even read that in our Constitution. Most civilized societies see people as having value, but really we don't always live that way. And I would say it's even counterculture to say all people have value, because in a world like this, we like to be selective of who we think has value and who we don't. Some people will argue that there is value for people who are on a womb, but then they forget the people who are here and are poor and are powerless. On the flip side, it's the opposite. They'll argue for those who are hurting around, but then discard the child that is in the womb. Some hate the rich, some despise those in power, some reject those who have a differing viewpoint. But here's why the concept of Imago Dei matters so much, is because it says that all people from womb to tomb have value and have worth in God's eyes. And here's where this keeps going, is we have an obligation to those people. In the New Testament, in Mark chapter 12, Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? What is the most important thing that we need to build our lives around? And he actually says, he answers him. He says, the most important is, listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord with all your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Right? He said, God created you. Love him above everything else. But then he says, the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no command greater than this. He's saying love people that were created in God's image, just like you were created in God's image, because they have value, they have worth. Now it's really easy to say this, but here's where we need to ask ourselves is, do we actually do it? Does this sound like me? Do I love my neighbor like myself? And what does your neighbor mean? It means everyone around you. When we ask this, and as we were like, I was wrestling with this week, is asking myself is like, do we care about children being aborted? Do we care about children in foster care or orphans all around our world? Do we care about survivors from abusive relationships and how to love them and how to care for them as they walk through that baggage? Do we care about people who are discriminated against because of their ethnicity? Do we care about the mentally ill who can't break the cycle, who can't get out of their situation? Do we care about those who are poor, who are powerless, who seem to be stuck in their ruts? Do we even care, on a more superficial term, about the jerk who cuts you off on the freeway? Or that person who drives you crazy on social media and you just want to tell as a moron over and over again? Do we truly love those around us like they have value and like they have worth? Here's the deal, this doesn't line up with our ideologies. And when we sometimes pick a section of society we want to follow, if we want to go right, if we want to go left, someone's going to be left out in there. But Christ says, love all the people around you. Show that they have worth, that they have distinction, that there is something different about them, and they have value in God's eyes just like you have value. But being made in the image of God continues on. And this next point is that it's also important because people have distinction. Check out verse 27. He said, so God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and he created female. Now this verse actually starts and it kind of flows out from verse 26. In verse 26, God says, let there be. And he said, this is what's going to happen. And then verse 27 is actually the act of creation. Mankind is actually created. But then at the very end of this verse, there's an important detail here. And it says, he created them male and female. We live in a time that there is becoming more and more confusion and less clarity when it comes to topics like this. I want to stop right here. And I want you to hear my heart and hear the heart, I think, of what we need to capture with Jesus and in this text. Is this can be a time where as the church, as Christians, we can puff our chest out and we can become rude, we can become arrogant, and we can become jerks. We can say, this is what God's word says, like line up or you're gonna burn, right? And people will do that and people say that. But here's the heart of it is there's gonna be some truth that we dive in here and we're gonna continue this next week that is so different than our culture. But we don't present this as high and mighty, like we're above people, like we're smarter than people, but we present this like all people have value and people have worth and we love them just like Christ loved them. But as we get into this topic and as we see here, what does it mean that God created us with distinction? Well, if you Google currently, and I actually did this past week, if you Google how many genders are there, you're gonna get a crazy mess of information. And what's nuts about this, and I tried to get, because usually, like I said, my two favorite resources, I go to the Bible and I go to Google. And usually when I go to Google, about 8 or 9 out of 10 top sites on the front page usually agree when it comes to a topic and something. But when you put in how many genders are there, you're gonna get a lot of different answers. 2, 8, 16, 34, 75, it was insane. And so I started reading scientific journals and it was still all over the map. It's like there's not consensus here in so many ways. What there is consensus is when it comes to science, they still have only identified 2 sex genes, what they say. More of a male and a female sex gene that kind of help guide this process. But then the more you read, it becomes very convoluted and very messy, and there is no kind of solid answer when you get to so many of these things as you click through. And I would say go with caution as you go down that rabbit hole, because you could be reading for a long time and not get any smarter as you do it. But here's where I come with all this. Is there are going to be some times, and there's some hardships in here because there are some outlier issues, and I want to address this like intersex, etc. But what you can't make scientific laws on outliers that go against the natural. Instead, you make a law based on the norm instead of the exception. But here's the deal: when the majority of a culture is moving one direction, it's going to move there no matter what. Whether science is against it, whether biblical truth is against it. And right now, our culture is very much moving in one direction. We're in the middle of a month right now, Pride Month, that is just kind of pushing and shoving down your throat of what our world stands for. And is so different and so against what we just read, and God created them male and female. Now, how do we put all this together? And we're going to talk a little bit about how we respond to this in a second. But I think here's where we need to kind of establish is we need to fall on truth, but we need to do it in a loving manner. Because it can be so easy to be a loud jerk on social media right now. Or it can so easy to go into a business that you see something that is offensive to you and you can make it known and say something that you will regret and doesn't represent Christ at all. But here we need to first establish that God is very clear in his word. He doesn't whisper, he doesn't say it silently, but he says God created them male and female. There was distinction in Imago Dei in his creation of how he created it, the way he created it, but how we carry this out in a loving manner is very important. But lastly, let's see why the last important part of why it is so vital that we understand that we're created in God's image is because people also have responsibility. Check out verse 28. It said God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. God also said, look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth, and every tree whose fruit contains seeds. This will be food for you. Verse 30, for all the wildlife of the earth, for every bird of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth, everything having the breath of life in it, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good indeed. Evening came, and then morning, the sixth day. God, if you followed us before, God kind of created things in stages, and he created the fish and the birds. He actually blessed them, and he said, multiply, like fill your domain. But here, he says to mankind, you're still kind of the ultimate boss here. God's the ultimate boss. But he tells mankind, you're to rule this world. He says, subdue it. And then the commentary on this is to rule over it. And part of being an image bearer is mankind's job on earth is to be like God in ruling over what he has created. Now I say that, and that's kind of like a scary concept, because ever since, like for centuries, and I would say since human existence, humans have argued over what is the best type of rulership or best type of government. Here in America, right, we discuss that all the time. We love our democracy and our republics and say we elect people who we think are fit, except we don't think any of them are fit anymore, right? But in theory, right, they're fit, that they go in there and they represent us. But actually, do you know what the greatest type of government and rulership is that you can't argue with? It's a benevolent dictator. Oh, I just said a really bad word there, dictator, right? Because that's a scary word. But actually the best type of rulership is someone who is truly loving, who is truly caring, who is in charge and takes care of all their people. Now here's the problem. There's this thing in the world called sin, and there's no really good benevolent dictators. You read the Bible and they ask for a king, they ask for a king, they ask for a king, and they got some good kings at first, and then it went downhill really, really fast. And you see, in mankind, still, we have this so hard when we try to follow this model of like, how do we like tend? And actually in the garden, we see God as a benevolent dictator who is giving responsibility to Adam and letting him rule over the garden. And that's how it was designed to be before there was a fallen world, which we're gonna get to in the coming weeks. But here's, I think, what we need to pull from this as we say we have responsibility is our responsibility in a fallen world is to fight for a correct rulership of our world. Are we doing our job in caring for and loving our neighbor, but also taking care of God's creation? Are we taking care of our planet? Are we taking care of animals? Are we taking care of our families? Now, when I say with that animals, don't use that excuses to get more pets in your house. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. But someone's like, that means I need to get more foster dogs or something. Like, that's a real thing. Did you hear that? Foster animals. Someone said that one to me. I was like, what? Did you just call a foster kid an animal? And they're like, no, like a foster dog. I'm like, that shouldn't be a real thing. Like, what is that? Anyway, I'm sorry. But are we taking care of our families, our neighbors? Are we taking care of one another? And you're like, okay, so how do we wrap all this in? And here's the time I think we need to start to reflect. Do you truly have a widespread view of Imago Dei? Do you truly think people are made in the image of God? Because it's super easy to say it, but do we actually live that way? Do we actually live like the people around us have value? Or do we yell at them? Do we scream at them? Are we annoyed with them? Do we get angry by them? Or do we love them and care for them like they are God's creation just like us? You see, whether the answer is no and needs to become a yes, or it's a yes and you need to apply it more fully, the real challenge then becomes, well, then how do we apply this in our world today? Because it's one thing to say, yes, like I agree with that. But let me phrase it this way, is how do we live in a world who opposes that we are creating God's image? How do we live in a world that is opposed to this idea of God's image, how he created that people have value, they have distinction, they have responsibility? In a world that says that's not right and I'm opposing it, how do we live that way? Because I'll be honest, it's even hard to do when you have people that agree with you. In my family, it's me, my wife, and like I said, 3 kids, right? They're 5, 4, and 9 months. And I think we all have the same goal in our family, is we want to love each other, right? My kids say sometimes, I don't like you, I love you, and they like pause and say it. They think it's hilarious. I'm like, ha, 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 ha. And I'm like, you're not funny, you're a jerk. And then they actually show that they don't like me sometimes. But we all have the same goal of we want to love each other, we want to care about each other, and our family is on the same, we have the same viewpoints, the same worldview. I know they're still developing theirs as little kids, but we all have the same goal in mind. But we still fight. We still get angry. We still have conflict. We still have issues. So how, if we can barely do it in your own family, how can you start to apply this to the world when they don't have the same goals, when they don't have the same viewpoint, the same worldview to operate from? Well, I think today we're going to kind of get a couple things to pull out of this. And as we transition from chapter 1 to chapter 2, I'm going to kind of give you 2 action steps that I think that as God finishes creation, how he wraps it up is super important. And the first one is we need to rest in God's work. Check out Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 1. It says this: "So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. On the 7th day, God had completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done." I don't know about you, but it can feel so exhausting when you read social media, when you go to work, when you interact with people, and it's constantly like they're disagreeing with you, constantly like, right, you don't belong, constantly like opposing what you're saying or opposing your beliefs, and even if you're not making those known, opposing what you think is right. And this could be a number of issues. This could be abortion and social justice, gender identity, the list goes on and on and on. And when you see that stuff over and over and over again, it can be exhausting. We're like, man, our world is so broken, it is beyond redemption. And you can be like, man, just God, like this, we got to be at end times, right? God, like Jesus, my brother said this the other day when we were talking about something, is that Jesus has to be like lacing up his Air Jesuses right now. He's putting on the sneakers, he's tying the knots and ready to come down. I'm just kidding, don't take that too far. But the problem is it becomes exhausting when we feel like then we have to be God's lawyer in our world. Like when we see all this wrong, be like, hey, let me tell you why you're wrong. Hey, I gotta interject here. I gotta say something here. I gotta say, oh no, you're representing this wrong, or you represent that right. And you gotta stick up and you gotta argue about everything. We feel like we have to be God's protector and his mouthpiece, and we can almost feel like the success of our world can fall on us. But here's the deal. God's creation wasn't dependent on the success of Adam and Eve. And Jesus' victory on the cross and his resurrection isn't dependent on how we live today. You see, what we need to realize is we are responsible for being representatives of God, of being true image bearers that love people, that speak his truth unashamedly, and does that to our best of our ability. But the success or failure of the church and ultimately of God's kingdom is not dependent on us. It's dependent on God. And God has done that work, is still doing that work, and will forever do that work. But we can rest in the fact that God is sovereign and God is control of everything. And so often I feel like we bear the responsibility where we put this weight on ourselves as like, man, I really need to argue and correct that social media post. Or I really need to I need to follow that guy home and tell him he shouldn't have cut me off because I was really mean to do, right? Just approach him. Don't do that. I was kidding. But we feel like we have to almost like correct all the bad behavior that's in our worlds. And God's like, no. I died for you and all the mistakes you made, but I also died for all the mistakes everyone else around you did as well. But we can also go to this second point, is not only do we need to rest in God's work, but we need to reflect on God's holiness. Let's keep going in verse 3. It said, God blessed the 7th day, and he declared it holy, for on it he rested from all of his creation. You see, the point of day 7, or what would become what we know as the Sabbath, wasn't because God was tired. I firmly believe that. We don't get anything in scripture that says one way or another that God was tired, but I believe an eternal, all-powerful God that spoke everything to existence. I don't think he was sweating. He wasn't like Josh after this worship set, right? Just drenched in sweat. I believe God was fine, but he rested as kind of a model for us to follow for years to come. And when God actually rested, it was an example for us to walk in line. And that would be because that ultimately that rest wasn't for nothing, but he made that day, he declared it holy so that when we rest, we can reflect on God's holiness and we can reflect on how do we better show that to the world around us. You see, this holy day would be a time for mankind to realize that God above all else is holy. In us being created in his image, we are called to reflect that glory. Paul speaks about this in the New Testament, and he calls us to what he says, put on the image of God, right? We're created in God's image, and he says to put this image of God on that we can truly live out through Jesus. In Colossians 3:10, it says, and have put on the new self, and you are being renewed in knowledge according to the image of your creator. Ephesians 4:24 says, and to put on the new self, the one created according to God's likeness in righteousness and purity of the truth. Are we reflecting God, and are we using that time to see his holiness and act accordingly? One of the things that I hate that social media does, and maybe some people have apps for this too. My wife has an app called Time Hop, and it brings up all these old pictures that happened on that day. And Facebook now, if you have one, will do that automatically. It says on this day, 2 years ago, this is what you did. It's like, I don't care what I did, okay, on that. And the real problem is when it comes up 10 or 15 years ago. Have you seen those? Nobody embarrasses you like yourself 10 to 15 years ago. Not even just like the fashion or just the way you looked or what you did or like what activity you were doing, like whatever that is. Like it's just sometimes the things that embarrass me the most are the things I posted and said. And there are people that I went to school with, I went to high school and college with, that I have no relationship with anymore because I've seen past posts come up and us arguing back and forth. And I know they don't know Jesus. I know they're far from him, but I also know I burned a bridge because I was an idiot and thought I was smarter than I really was. And so often, we can get caught up in this where instead of reflecting God's holiness, instead of reflecting his love, we want to live by what we think is right and wrong, or we want to live so we need to make the world a better place, so I'm going to tell everyone they're wrong, I'm going to correct their behavior, and I'm going to fix everything. Do that with your kids, right? Don't try to do that with your neighbor. It's not going to work as correctly as well. But so often here, we need to just reflect on the fact that God made all of us in his image, but then he also calls us to reflect on the fact that he's done the work and he is holy above all else. Let me give you a key challenge this morning. And this is how we're going to kind of wrap this up today. And what I want you to ask yourself, and I want you to truly reflect on this week, is are you ready to live like you are created in the image of God? Not just to say it, not just to say, I know this theological term, I know that God created me in his image, I am created like him, but know that you will have value, you are special, but so are all those people around you. This past week, I was scrolling through social media. I've had too many social media things. This is what makes me the most angry, right? And I was like seeing all these things people were saying, and I started typing. And then Jesus, the Holy Spirit just told me, don't send that. And then I started typing again. And then I actually started screenshotting and texting some of my friends like, this is really bad. I need to respond, right? They're like, dude, don't respond. And I'm like, there is nothing in that is going to show the love of Jesus. That's going to show I care about people. That is show that I have value. It's just me spouting my opinion. And even sometimes spouting God's truth in a way that is not loving. But what would it look like if we got down in the ugliness, in the grittiness, and we knew those people around us? We had face-to-face conversations. We walked alongside those people when they're struggling and when they're hurting. And we got to share the love and the truth of Jesus Christ. How would that change our community? How would that help further the church if we're more concerned with reflecting the image of God than reflecting whatever goals and things we have in our lives? My prayer is that we can be that church and we can be that people. Let's pray this morning.